So welcome to the fifth lecture of moral psychology. As you may know, this is the second of two lectures in part two of the course, which is about the question, do cultural differences in moral psychology explain political conflict on climate change? Now, to address this question, I'm following a very simple plan, and the plan is to work through a short but very dense paper by Feinberg and Willer called The Moral Roots of Environmental Attitudes. What I've done is divided their paper into 5 claims, and last week we looked at 3 claims. I just want to remind you what those 3 claims are. So the first of these is that moral convictions and the emotions they evoke shape political attitudes. Now, the thing to note here is that it's specifically moral convictions as opposed to convictions generally. And in addition to the evidence I presented for this in the previous section, I want just to add one tiny thing here. You see, climate skepticism, so people who are doubtful that humans have influenced the climate skepticism, is fairly prevalent in a variety of countries, including the US and North America, although scientific consensus on this is extremely high. So it's one of the things that, as a human, you can be most certain about. Humans have changed the climate, beyond doubt. So here's the thing. How strong is a belief in anthropogenic climate change as a predictor of behaviour, right? As opposed to being a skeptic. So think about a US context where there are indeed many skeptics, surprisingly. So Hornsey and Fielding are reporting in a review of some research, and they say believers in climate change are more likely than skeptics to report that they intend to behave in climate-friendly ways, but on actual behaviours the difference is modest. Interesting. And this is very striking, of course, because we're talking about people who are essentially a kind of conspiracy theorists, right, who deny, despite overwhelming scientific evidence, that there is anthropogenic climate change. And what you're saying is that compared to those, people who actually believe in this are not really doing anything, right? Anything any different. There's barely any difference. Knowing whether people are skeptics or believers tell you surprisingly little about their willingness to engage in actions that matter. For example, the difference between believers and skeptics in terms of their willingness to put a price on carbon is relatively small. And if we go to the meta-analysis that these comments are based on, if we go over to the meta-analysis, that confirms that knowing whether people are skeptics or believers tells you surprisingly little about their willingness to engage in action. So what you can see from the 2016 meta-analysis that they're commenting on is that almost every measure that you can imagine, being a believer versus a skeptic, has very little difference, only a small effect on how strongly you would endorse that policy. The only one where we reliably get a medium size effect is prioritising the economy, prioritising the environment over the economy, which is, I suppose, the least specific of these policies. So the message here is very simple. It's not what you believe, it's not the attitudes that you have or the convictions that you have generally, it's specifically moral convictions. Now, some good news here though as well. So this is a study by Bolgerich and colleagues where they just created a display and gave people the opportunity to take a leaflet offering a free tyre pressure test. In the control condition, it just said, take a leaflet. And what you can see there is that there were quite a few coupons taken. The number of coupons actually went down when the poster advertising the leaflet said, take a pressure tyre check, this will make you safer. Or take a pressure tyre check, this can actually save you money, which is true. Having your tyres at good pressure can save you money, use less energy. What was interesting is when the justification for taking a leaflet was, this can help the climate, people were actually vastly more likely, and this is the only condition where they're more likely in the control condition, to take a leaflet. So what we're saying here, it's not exactly all bad news. What we're saying is that merely believing something or having an attitude, even quite a strongly held attitude, won't necessarily predict your behaviour. But putting it in moral terms, this action will be a good action because it will reduce harm, actually motivates people to act. It is the moral convictions and the emotions they evoke that shape political attitudes. Very good. Now on from this, the second claim, you remember we covered this last time in quite some detail actually. There are at least 2 fundamental domains of morality, including harm and purity. So there's a strong commitment here to moral pluralism. That was the second claim. The third claim is essentially that moral foundations theory is true, liberals and conservatives possess different moral profiles. Liberals tend to load up more on concerns about avoiding harm and unfairness. Conservatives think those are important, but no more important than things like purity, loyalty to one's in-group and respect for authority, things that liberals tend to minimise the importance of. So the claim. So that's where we've got to so far. You object to paying £9,000 to be taught by an old duffer in a onesie. Not a onesie. This is my wingsuit. It's not a onesie. I know, but look, I mean, half of you here are in your onesies anyway, right? You're in your onesies anyway, and then you're objecting that I'm wearing my wingsuit. I find that most unfair. The other half are not even out of bed yet. I got an email last week. I'm really sorry I missed your lecture. I overslept. They're recorded. You overslept for a week? Who knows? Lockdown, strange times. You overslept for a week though. I do like that. I missed your recorded lecture because I overslept. Best yet. All right, see if anyone can beat that. So what was the fourth claim? You see, here are the three claims. Ignore the hecklers. Here are the three claims that we've covered so far. Now we're on to the last two claims in this lecture this week. So the fourth claim was the view that liberals express greater levels of environmental concern than do conservatives, in part because liberals are more likely to view environmental issues in moral terms. Very important there. All right. So here it's interesting because we're getting to potential causes and therefore moving on to thinking about how interventions might work. So this claim is backed up by two studies that work together. The first study involved giving people one of three stories. So each person received one of three stories. In the control condition, nothing very interesting happened. In the not recycle condition, the character in the story, I think it was called John, the character in the story finished eating his lunch and then threw his lunch stuff into an ordinary bin, did not recycle. And in the third story, the character called John did recycle his stuff. Now, what you see amongst people who identified as politically liberal is that they were asked after the story, in each case, they're asked after the story to rate how moral or immoral they found John's actions on a scale from 0 to 5, 1 to 5. And you can see what they found was that among the liberal population, they treated the not recycling behaviour as significantly less moral than either the control condition or the recycling behaviour. So they don't think that recycling makes you somehow especially virtuous compared to the control condition. They think that not recycling makes you particularly bad, right? And this is the kind of caricature of the liberal person. So the liberal person is more likely to commit murder than to drop litter on the street, right? That's the caricature borne out by the study here. Whereas what you can see for conservatives is that there's actually no significant difference between the three stories. They don't think of somebody who chucks their lunch away as doing something without recycling it, chucks the wrappers away, as doing something that's any more immoral than, recycling your lunch or not having a wrapped lunch at all. All right, very good. That doesn't really help us though, because the hypothesis here is a causal hypothesis. The claim is this: liberals are more likely to view environmental issues in moral terms, and that's why they're more concerned to act. It's because of that moral conviction. But the previous study, which is 1A, we've only got a correlation. We haven't got causation, we've only got correlation. So what we need then is to look to see whether we can get something closer to this because. And what Feinberg and Willer tell us, this is study 1B, is that they did a mediation analysis which revealed that perception of the environment as a moral issue was a significant partial mediator of the relationship between liberalism and environmental attitudes. So what does that mean? What is a mediation analysis and what is a mediator? Well, here's a very simple way to understand this from the very paper that they cite, Preacher and Hayes. And the paper they cite is extremely complicated, and that paper is really about getting hold of multiple mediators simultaneously, which as far as I can see Feinberg and Willer are not doing. So I'm just using the very simple version of this. So here's the idea: there's an unmediated connection here. So here's, for example, political ideology, socially conservative, socially liberal, and the idea is that's mapping directly onto environmental attitudes. Didn't recycle a lunch, gosh, terrible. What a crime. And here is the mediated. So the idea is that you can see whether this benefits your data. You have got political identity here, but political identity is a predictor. It's bound up with whether or not you lean towards emphasizing harm and care much more so than things like purity, in-group loyalty, respect for authority, or not. Right? So this is your moral foundation, the mediating factor, which in turn is then causing your differences in the attitude to the environment. And the idea is that via the mediation analysis, essentially you can work out which of the two models better fits your data. And if you think this model better fits your data, then you can say, okay, so we've got a mediating factor. It's not political identity as such. It's the moral psychology that's driving the environmental attitudes. So this is not super strong for causation, but it pushes us in that direction. It provides us with some evidence that it's because of the moral concerns that liberals tend to think of environmental issues in moral terms. That's the idea. Now just here you might say, well look, what about beyond the US? What about a sample beyond the US? And it's notable that in the study with the mediation analysis, Feinberg and Willer are using undergraduate students, presumably from a single university in North America. Now the US is a special population in many ways. What you notice, for example, is that climate skepticism in the US is related to political ideology in a way that it is in few other countries. So what you see here is left versus right political ideology. How closely is that associated with climate skepticism? So here the idea is that climate skepticism in the US is strongly associated with being socially conservative rather than socially liberal. And the same is true in Australia, but in many other countries it's not true at all. There is no strong association. And indeed in some countries like India, it goes the other way. So what Hornsey and colleagues noticed is that in roughly 3/4 of countries, the relation between political conservatism and climate skepticism is statistically non-significant. There isn't one, as far as we know. Now, so that tells us, all I'm saying here is, look, the US context is special, and so we may not find that this result generalises across different countries. So it's worth looking to see whether there is something in another country. And I found it quite difficult to find further evidence along these lines, but I did find one study based on New Zealand, and we know from other research that New Zealand tends to be a little bit different in terms of political identity and moral foundation. So this, to me, was a potentially highly relevant study. These days I also have in the era of Trump and Johnson and the rest, I always have a particular soft spot for New Zealand. It's never seemed like such an attractive place to live. So here's what the researchers found. It's very interesting. It's an interaction between political identity and where you are on the individualizing moral foundations. I had to invert this. You can see this is inverted. I had to invert this because for some reason the researchers put the left on the right. That's to say, the more socially liberal you are in their graph, the further right you are. And that's very confusing because socially liberal is always associated with the left, right? Since the time of the French Revolution. And these researchers want to do it the other way around. I guess that's New Zealand, right? Something about New Zealand. Who knows? Anyway, so I had to invert it. Sorry about that. But what you're looking at here is something very simple. So this box line is exactly what you would expect. So here are people who are high on individualizing foundations. So they tend to think that harm and fairness are particularly important, more important than other things. And what you find is that the further left they are, the more they care about conserving electricity. As those people move right in their political ideology, they tend to care less. Whereas these are people who are low on individualizing foundations, so tend to focus to a greater extent than the other people on things like purity and respect for authority, a loyalty to your in-group. What you find with these people is actually they move in the opposite direction. So the more right they go, in the New Zealand context, the more likely they are to care about conserving energy. So this is a little bit different from what Feinberg and Willer report. We're not saying here that your moral psychology mediates the effect of your political identity on your environmental behaviours. That's what Feinberg and Willer found. What these researchers have found in the New Zealand context is there's actually an interaction between the two things. So your environmental behaviour is actually a function both of your political identity and your moral psychology. The two things interact in order to produce that behaviour. So this is interesting. I don't think it exactly contradicts what Feinberg and Willer found. I think it supports the general idea, the general claim that they're making, which is that to some extent, it's because of your willingness to view environmental issues in moral terms, that you express more environmental concern rather than your political ideology directly. Whether it's a mediator or there's an interaction here, I really think at this point we can't say. We would like a broader research sample, which I wasn't able to find. But I will say provisionally, I think this claim, the fourth claim that we're studying, is true. But things are about to get really exciting, because now we're off to look at what happens when you intervene on the moral attitudes towards the climate.